everyone, and welcome to our last lecture for this unit. Today we're going to be focusing on Chapter 4, which discusses sentencing and offender classification. In this section, we're going to be discussing the change from indeterminate to determinate sentencing, how a sentence is actually recommended, the factors that can influence a sentence, and specialized courts that have been set up as a way to divert first-time offenders out of the formalized system. That's a lot of information to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. To start, we know that once we are convicted of a crime, the defendant then has to be sentenced. That sentence can come in the form of a community sentence, such as probation, or an institutional punishment, such as incarceration in prison. There can also be a mixture of the two that actually occurs. But everything is varied, and it's going to reflect the type of crime that's committed, the crime severity, and the defendant's criminal background. The two biggest determinants of sentencing are the offense severity and the defendant's criminal history. These two determinants are important as our criminal laws are centered around the severity of the criminal conduct and the seriousness of the offender's criminal past. If the offense is not harmful or severe, such as a low-level drug or property offense, then in theory the individual should be sentenced less harshly than someone who has committed a more severe offense like assault or battery. The other issue lies in the defendant's criminal history. Our punishment structures are set up so that first-time offenders receive less harsh punishments than habitual criminals. Based on these two determinants, the type and the time of the sentence will vary. Just as we stated, more severe offenses and longer criminal histories will result in longer sentences and incarceration-based punishments. Less severe offenses and less extensive criminal histories will result in less time being served and possibly community-based sentences. Even though your sentence may be community-based, there are still a variety of other factors that are in play that can have an effect on your sentence. For instance, most defendants have to abide by specific conditions that require them to remain compliant with, or they can be violated and sent back to jail or prison for a short-term punishment sentence. Common conditions may include random drug testing through urinalysis, no contact with the victim, community service, counseling or treatment, curfews, home confinement, electronic monitoring, and a variety of other conditions. In the past, we used to use an indeterminate sentencing structure. Remember we talked about this one before? Indeterminate sentencing meant that when I was sentenced, I got a range between 5 and 10 years, and after the first 5 years, I might be eligible for parole. However, we know that this is not the case anymore. There are too many perceived issues with the indeterminate sentencing, and at the time there were some parolees who were committing a few high-profile offenses that the government essentially wanted to lock down. So the country turned towards determinate sentencing in the early 1980s. The federal government abolished parole, and with it they increased the amount of people that are currently being incarcerated. Before, there used to be a lot more judicial discretion. Now we have what we call sentencing guidelines, which we're going to get to later in the lecture. Under this new style, there are set factors that will influence a person's sentence, but for the most part, there should be strong consistency across the board. However, it doesn't always work that way. Let's look at two really great examples of what's happening when sentencing loses its logic. The first example I have for you is a man named Salvatore, or nicknamed Sammy the Bull, Gravano. Sammy the Bull was the highest ranking member of the 5 families who ended up breaking the Cosa Nostra oath. That's basically the code of silence within these families, and he went to go talk to authorities. He used to work for John Gotti as the underboss of the Gambino crime family, and he worked for the Colombo crime family earlier before he started working for the Gambinos. Gravano was the one who would actually do all the wet work for the Gotti family. Anytime that somebody needed to be taken care of, Gravano would be the one to actually do it. Basically, he showed that he was loyal to the family, and he was paid very well for his kills. He was making about $4,000 to $5,000 a week, and when there was a kill ordered, he would make a couple $100,000 extra depending on who it was that he was supposed to kill. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, the FBI finally had enough information to be able to go after the Gotti family. Gravano then turned on Gotti, and he ended up cooperating with the feds in order to get a reduced sentence. He actually confessed to 19 murders that were ordered by the families, but he ended up giving up so much information to the state that his sentence kept going lower and lower and lower. Gotti ended up getting life in prison, but Gravano only got 5 years in prison. 4 of them he had already served because he was confined during the whole process. After his sentence took place, he only had to serve 1 more year. Sometimes, on the other hand, sentencing goes in the exact opposite direction, and there are much more harsh sentences that are being handed out. This lady, I want you to meet her. Her name is Patricia Spotted Crow. She is the mother of 4, and she lives in Oklahoma. At the time of her offense, she was a first-time offender, and she ended up selling a small bag of marijuana to an undercover police officer. She sold it for exactly $31. The problem was not so much that she sold the weed to the undercover officer. The problem comes from the fact that she sold it while her 4 minor children were present. This led her to getting a possession in the presence of a minor charge placed against her. Spotted Crow ended up receiving 12 years for the sale of a $31 bag of marijuana to an undercover informant. Oklahoma is a very tough state to be in for a first-time offender and for also a woman being sentenced. Oklahoma actually leads the country in terms of the incarceration of women, with higher rates of minority women being incarcerated compared to whites, and in the amount of prison time that you will receive as a first-time offender. So she has 2 strikes against her. Spotted Crow's case actually received a large amount of media attention, and she ended up going up for parole very early, only after 2 years. She was then granted parole as a result of the media attention and the drive to get her out. She has been released. I share these 2 examples to show you that sentencing doesn't always add up the same for everyone. Depending on who you are and what connections you have, what offense you committed, all can lead to a variety of different sentences. This is what we call sentencing disparities in this country. We will discuss the ramifications of sentencing disparities later on in the semester. Part of the current sentencing structure requires that an investigation occur after the defendant is found guilty by the court. This investigation is called a pre-sentence investigation report, and depending on the agency, you will hear this being referred to as either a PSI or a PSR. So before your conviction takes place, the court then prepares the PSR in order to give to the judge. While you're in pretrial detention before you make bond, or while you're on pretrial supervision, the beginnings of the PSR start. The purpose of the PSR is to provide a recommendation to the judge regarding your sentence. There is a formula that state and federal courts use. Based on a number of factors, the court enters all of your information and you land in a range for the sentence that they're going to recommend. This process normally involves background checks in order to see your criminal history and the extent of it, and it involves the interview of the defendant themselves. The probation officer will ask the defendant about employment history, if you currently are employed, when was the last time you were employed, housing history, do you own or rent the place that you're living in, educational background, how far did you go through in school, did you go to college, those sorts of things. Issues about your family life, do you have any kids, are you married, who are your closest associates in terms of family and friends, do you have a history of substance abuse, and if so, what drug was your drug of choice? If you had a history of substance abuse, do you also have a history of substance abuse treatment? And is there a history of mental health issues taking place? These are all the items that I was discussing are then entered into this formula for your sentencing. Each of these items gets a point that is associated with it that either aid in lowering or increasing the sentence that is going to be given to the defendant. For example, higher levels of education get you less points, whereas a more substantial criminal history ends up getting you more points. Think about it this way. The items more associated with criminality increase your score. and the items that are less associated with criminality are going to decrease your score and your total sentence. As I stated before, the PSR is completed by the court, but more specifically by a probation officer. These interviews are not the same as an investigation interview that would occur after an arrest takes place. These interviews take place after the conviction has occurred and the police are not involved at all. These are more relaxed in tone and are often informal in nature. However, defendants don't realize that information that is being provided during these interviews can still be used against them. Let's take the case of Minnesota v. Murphy, for instance. This is a self-incrimination case that had to deal with whether or not Fifth Amendment protections extended to post-conviction supervision. So in this case, Mr. Murphy was sentenced to probation for a sex-related crime, and he was ordered to be truthful with his probation officer in all matters. So he was truthful about a previous murder that he committed but was never charged with. Well, his probation officer got the wheels rolling on the murder charges. They basically went and told the DA what Murphy told him. He was eventually convicted for the murder as well. Murphy then said, "You can't use that statement against me because no one read me my Miranda rights." Then SCOTUS turned around and said that probation officers do not have to read the probationer his Miranda rights, but insist that their Fifth Amendment rights are not being violated. Instead, it is up to the probationer to assert his or her own Fifth Amendment protections and then tell the probation officer that he or she is not going to be speaking. But if the probationer asserts those rights and then the officer tells me, talk or I'm going to revoke your probation, then the situation is unconstitutional. The officer has no authority to threaten Fifth Amendment rights of the probationer, rather. So the PSR is complete and it is time for the defendant to be sentenced. If the defendant is a federal defendant, then that individual will be sentenced via the sentences developed by the U.S. Sentencing Commission. The U.S. Sentencing Commission is in Washington and is made up of different advisors that determine what the appropriate sentencing guidelines would be for federal cases. It was developed in 1984 after the indeterminate sentencing structure was deemed to be ineffective. With the establishment of the United States Sentencing Commission guidelines, the federal government switches from indeterminate to determinate sentencing. So instead of parole, inmates now know that they're going to have to serve a mandatory minimum of their sentence. Typically, this means about 85% of your sentence if you include good time credits. When we have new crimes or charges to criminal statutes, the Sentencing Commission has to come up with appropriate sentences to be written into law. With indeterminate sentencing, there was just too much judicial discretion that was taking place, and people felt like the sentence was going to be given depending on the mood of the judge that day. So now, going to a determinate system, there would be no more discretion that allowed judges to go way over or way under what an appropriate sentence should be. That is where the establishment of these policies come into play. The United States Sentencing Commission is responsible for creating the formulas for sentencing, for making sure that these sentences are appropriate for the given crime, but in effect then eliminates the idea of judicial discretion almost completely. When new sentences are created, the United States Sentencing Commission wants to be sure that they're creating sentences that are appropriate. So they have to review themselves to see how they are doing. They collect data and they analyze it, and then they evaluate how effective their policies really are. But the problem here is, what do you mean by effective? If you mean keeping everyone in the same sentencing grid, then sure, 100% effective. If you mean creating a system that is better equipped to handle offenders and to keep prisons regulated and to be able to handle what is headed there, then not so much, not very effective by those standards. One of the ways in which we are trying to alleviate some of the issues stemming from mandatory sentencing guidelines is the creation of specialized or problem-solving courts. These courts have been established in order to keep select offenders from being processed formally through the criminal justice system, where something like a prison sentence would do more harm than good. These types of courts were established to have low-key stakes type of remedy. That means it has the potential to develop into a large-scale punishment, provided that the offender remains compliant with the court's direct direction for the offender. But at the end of the day, these individuals still committed a crime. So how does that actually balance out? Really, what these specialized courts say to the offender is that either you comply and go to treatment and get sober, or you will go to jail or prison. It is basically a suspended sentence. You won't go to prison unless you violate the terms of your drug court conditions. Then you'll go to prison. None of these courts are mandatory. If you decide as the defendant you don't want help, then you can still elect to go through a traditional court. This is not an escape of punishment. However, there is recognition that criminal behavior is not simply about the crime. There are a variety of different issues that go into why somebody would commit that behavior. The most common type of specialty court that we have are drug courts. These are set up to help with addiction and substance abuse issues, and they work to get help that the defendants need without throwing them into prison and expecting them to figure it out on their own. The newest model of specialty courts is the Veterans Treatment Court. This is sort of a hybrid between a drug court and a mental health court, which is used in aid of military veterans and active duty personnel. These courts promote sobriety, recovery, and stability through a coordinated response that involves collaboration with the traditional partners found in drug courts and mental health courts, as well as the Department of Veteran Affairs healthcare networks, the VA Benefits Administration, and State Department of Veteran Affairs, volunteer veteran mentors, and organizations that support veterans and their families. But as I said before, if the veteran or other offender does not comply with the orders of the specialized court, then that individual can still be processed through the formalized criminal justice system and can still face a criminal punishment. So let's begin by looking at drug courts. Drug courts were one of the first specialty courts to really focus on one of the main problems that a lot of offenders face: substance abuse. Drug courts started in Miami in the late 1980s in order to curtail some of the high numbers of drug offenders that were coming out of the area then. If you know anything about Miami in the 1980s, then you know that there were a lot of drug runners who were bringing in high quality coke to the place. It is a party town with a lot of money, and a lot of people were enjoying that scene. The problem was that coke in the 1970s and 1980s was no longer a rich person's drug. If you cut powder cocaine with baking powder and whatever else you want to lace it with, you end up getting crack cocaine, which is cheaper, and some people claim it is more addictive because you have to smoke it rather than snort it. But pharmacologically, it is the exact same drug. So while powder was the problem, crack was actually a much bigger problem in the city at the time. Because of the growing number of drug defendants that are being seen in court, the city got together with the state and put together this system that allowed drug offenders to receive treatment rather than just being locked up in hopes that they would dry out. They were also really tired of seeing the same faces in court all of the time for the exact same problem. Each state is going to run their courts a bit differently, but for the most part, they're pretty much run off of the Miami model. That model is going to include all of these items that you see here on your screen. But drug courts are really only for a specialized type of offender in order to stop the addiction rather than to punish the addiction. You aren't going to see drug traffickers or large-scale dealers going to drug courts. These are used for low-level offenders who might really only have had a small personal amount on his or her person. Or it's going to be arrested for nonviolent offenses that were committed in order to aid the addiction itself. On this slide, you can see a map of the United States and all of the established drug courts that we have throughout the country. We've come a really long way since the establishment of the Miami Drug Court in 1989. Now we have more than 2,500 drug courts across the United States. One of the best things that come from specialized courts is the return on the investment. These numbers are coming from drug court evaluations done over the years. We can see that drug court participants often recidivate less than those who do not go through drug court. On average, we see about a 32% difference between the groups. This suggests that drug court participants are committing less crime, after going through the program, and that saves us money. If they are not becoming a formalized part of the criminal justice system and are not becoming revolving door inmates, then that saves us a lot of money in the long run. And by a lot of money, I mean between $7 and $9 million a year per drug court. That's a lot of savings. In addition to drug courts, our second most populated specialty court is the mental health courts. Mental health courts want to supply help to those defendants who are showing a history of and present evidence of mental health issues. Without this help, the mental illness would no doubt get worse while they are incarcerated. Before the creation of these specialty courts, we were not diverting mental health inmates out of the criminal justice system. We were simply incarcerating them. They didn't always receive meds if they needed them, and we were putting them into an environment that actually breeds mental illness, thus making their health concerns that much worse. This slide shows that before the creation of the specialty mental health courts, we were simply incarcerating the mentally ill. We used to institutionalize a lot more offenders, but as this chart shows, there is almost a perfect reversal in terms of incarceration versus institutionalization rates. We just relied on incarceration and kept institutionalization for the most severe cases only. Those offenders who pop up in courts again and again are normally those who can't afford, aren't willing, or who simply stop taking their medications. Many of them are homeless or have trouble functioning in the real world. Mental health courts try to get these individuals back on their meds in order to stabilize them and get them back to a healthier frame of mind. Like the drug courts, if the offenders do not comply with these conditions, or if they go off their meds, then they're going to go to jail or prison to serve their suspended sentences. Like other specialized courts, mental health courts have shown strong successes in lowering recidivism levels among those offenders who go through the treatment programs compared to those who do not go through this process. In this lecture, we focused on the change from indeterminate to determinate sentencing, how a sentence is actually recommended, the factors that can influence a sentence, and specialized courts that have been set up as a way to divert first-time offenders out of the formalized system. These issues will continue to pop up again and again and again as we progress through the rest of these chapters. The change to a determinate sentencing structure has had a profound effect on the correctional system here in the U.S., namely in terms of overcrowding in prisons and the need to release en masse low-level offenders just to try and remain compliant with crowding levels. We will revisit these issues again very soon. In the next chapter, we're going to jump into a discussion of pretrial supervision in jails. Meet me back here next time as we explore the content of Chapter 5.